Last December, I posted a video on this press fiber sun helmet, and the press fiber sun helmet is interesting in itself. I suggest you go check it out, but one of the things that I didn't mention at the time is that my particular press fiber sun helmet has a very unique badge, a badge that represents a little remembered piece of U.S. military history that deserves to be remembered. There are a lot of reasons that I decided to start collecting military hats. They're certainly spectacular and visually appealing. There's almost an endless variety of them from around the world. They do represent history and all sorts of different eras of history. But there's also something about hats that's really interesting, and that is it's not just in the design and make of the hat, but there's also the badge on the hat, which can also be unique and becomes kind of a collection in itself. So, for example, this particular helmet here called a Pickelob, the emblem on the front represents Prussia. This is from a Prussian unit during the First World War, but the emblem on this particular Pickelob represents the Grand Duchy of New Baden. And so two different Pickelobs from different parts of Germany that fought in the First World War. And that makes it really interesting to think about collecting hats. So for example, this is a hat of the British Army's Royal Signal Corps. On the front of that hat, the emblem is actually the god Mercury, but members of the Corps refer to the emblem on the front of the hat as Jimmy. And I've talked about two nearly forgotten branches of the U.S. Uniformed Services, that is the NOAA Commission Corps and the National Public Health Service Commission Corps. These hats are Navy hats. They differ really only in their emblem, which is similar to the Navy emblem, but distinct for these two corps. And of course, in the case of the Public Health Service hat, also in the line that's on the hat band. So those make hats unique in different ways. And you can have the same hat with three different badges, and it has three different sets of meaning and three different things to talk about when you think about the history of hats. And the badges are actually really nifty. Sometimes they're valuable, more valuable than the hat itself. They're sometimes made out of precious metal. Some of them have sterling silver or gold in them. Sometimes they're even more valuable if they're actually worn and used and crusty, a condition that collectors call salty. But you don't find a lot of hat emblems that are more rare than the emblem that's on this press fiber sun helmet. Now, at first glance, when you look at that, it looks like a Navy badge, like a standard Navy badge, but actually, the Navy badge, the eagle and the shield are silver, and that's why on the Navy badge, unlike on an Army badge, it's usually made out of two pieces. But what really sets this badge apart is the addition of this insignia, described as a ship's steering wheel superimposed upon a shield charged with a wing car wheel on a rail. This is the insignia of the U.S. Army Transportation Corps. The winged wheel emblem was devised during the First World War and represents rail service. The shield is in the shape of that which is used for U.S. highway markers and thus represents road transportation, while the ship's wheel represents transportation by sea. But the badge on this press fiber sun helmet has the Army Transportation Corps emblem on what appears to be the eagle and crossed anchors of a Navy badge. And that represents it as a fairly unique badge because that badge belongs to the Army Transportation Corps Water Division. And what looks at first to be a Navy badge is in fact a badge for a U.S. Army employee. And there's a story for how that all comes together. The Second Continental Congress authorized a Quartermaster Corps in 1775 that had, among its duties, military transportation. While there was not a transport corps separate from the Quartermaster Corps in the Continental Army, there was some recognition of how vital the function was, and at one point, Washington suggested the creation of a post of Wagon Master General, although no such position was created. While the U.S. Quartermaster Corps was underfunded and had a huge learning curve, the difficulty for the British in supplying an army from across the ocean was far larger. British difficulties with supply essentially forced them to forage in America. This then opened up their forage parties to threats from guerrilla warfare, while at the same time preventing them from aggregating supplies enough to mount major operations. Thus, logistics forced the British to fight a war on America's terms. In future wars, however, the United States would face the same problem that the British did during the Revolutionary War. How do you move and supply armies across oceans? The issue first arose during the 1846-48 war with Mexico. When the Army landed some 10,000 troops under General Winfield Scott near Veracruz in March of 1847, it marked the first time the United States Army invaded an enemy's territory by sea, although of course U.S. Marines had done so during the Tripolitan War, but on a far smaller scale. Scott's landing at Veracruz went unopposed, and his force quickly compelled the surrender of the port and nearby fortress. But the landings demonstrated the difficulty of military transport. Neither the Army nor the Navy were equipped or prepared to transport large numbers of troops. To move the invasion force, the Army Quartermaster Corps had to charter or purchase 54 steam vessels, 4 ships, 2 barks, 8 brigs, 34 schooners, and 201 other boats, as well as chartering several hundred sail and steam vessels to move the troops and supplies to the embarkation points on the Texas coast. The invasion was an impressive feat by the Quartermaster Corps, led by the legendary Brigadier General Thomas Sidney Jessup, who served as the Quartermaster General of the United States Army for an astounding 42 years before dying in office in 1860 at the age of 72. However, it was not without particular difficulty. Jessup noted that the Quartermaster Corps was frequently embarrassed by the want of that practical knowledge which nautical men only possess, and suggested that the Navy should be responsible for operating transports for the Army. But nothing came of Jessup's suggestion, and the Army continued to charter private vessels when it needed to, for example, when they were moving troops to California before the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad. The problem arose again when the United States declared war on Spain in April of 1898. With operations both in the Caribbean, in Cuba and Puerto Rico, and in the Philippines, the Army had substantial need for transport ships. The difficulty in chartering enough vessels was complicated by the fact that Congress did not allow the Army to charter foreign-flagged vessels. While this was an issue in the Atlantic, where there simply weren't enough boats to be chartered, it was a far greater issue in the Pacific, where much more robust transports were needed for the 7,000-plus mile journey between California and the Philippine Islands. The issue became more acute when the U.S. fleet under Commodore George Dewey defeated the obsolete Spanish Pacific Squadron in the Battle of Manila Bay in May. Dewey now found Manila open to invasion, but had no land force to occupy the city. There was a risk that another foreign power, Germany or Great Britain, may take advantage of the situation and claim the Philippines. Troops were needed quickly. Finally, the Army realized that chartering merchant marine vessels was not going to be sufficient, and the Army decided to purchase its own vessels. The original 14 vessels purchased cost more than $6.2 million, not including the cost of refitting, a substantial sum at the time. The need to quickly acquire transport did not result in good conditions. One account of transport to the Philippines on the transport SS City of Sydney described the boat, previously used to transport cattle, as an awful thing to be placed in service as a transport to carry 1,000 men on a voyage of 8,000 miles. And an officer noted, right up to the day we arrived in Manila Bay, we were kept busy sweeping up horse manure and other filth that accumulated for years. As the voyage continued, men began to grow ill from the poor conditions and lack of fresh food, yet the ship carrying almost 1,000 soldiers only had a single doctor on board, called Old Doc Cooley. According to one source, Old Doc Cooley had a big brown pill that was a cure-all. Whether you had sore eyes or was troubled with constipation, you got one of those pills. To get some control over the issue, the Army Transport Service was created in the fall of 1898. Ships of the ATS had the prefix USAT for U.S. Army Transport. The ATS operated the Army's large ships, which continued to be needed as the Spanish-American War gave way to the Philippine Insurrection, or also called the Philippine-American War, and the Moro Rebellion, requiring that the Army continue to provide and supply troops in the Philippines, as well as to defend its newly supplied Pacific territories. These transports were also used to move troops from the Philippines to support the first international relief expedition, the multinational force sent to rescue besieged diplomats and civilians during the Boxer Rebellion in China in the summer of 1900. The U.S. entry into the First World War in 1917 offered new challenges. When the U.S. entered the war, the Allies were near collapse. In fact, the Germans had calculated that resuming unrestricted submarine warfare around Britain would draw the U.S. into war, but assumed that the U.S. would take a great deal of time to mobilize and move troops, allowing Germany to defeat the Allies before the U.S. could become a factor. Thus, there was a need to mobilize quickly, and that required a massive amount of transportation to move the 1,000,000 men of Pershing's American Expeditionary Force. But the ATS had been reduced to a shadow of itself by that time. The Army pressed a number of ships into service, including several German vessels that had been confiscated at the outset of war. The Army eventually manned 50 ships to support the AEF, but after issues with coordination and discipline, the War Department moved the Army fleet under the Navy's Overseas Transportation Service, or NOTS. But the move only applied to the European theater and was not fully realized before the end of the war. Still, the U.S.'s ability to rapidly raise and transport a large force to Europe much more quickly than German planners thought possible played a critical role in the Allied victory. As part of the World War I experience, the Army decided that it needed a single organization to manage the various modes of transportation, creating an Army Transportation Service, of which the Army Transport Service was a division, along with the divisions of rail, motor, and animal transport. This was the organization during the general reduction in force during the interwar period. At the outset of World War II, the Army recognized from its experience in the First World War that it needed to coordinate its transportation assets. In fact, the Army was operating boats and ships under at least 3 different organizations. The aforementioned Army Transport Service, which handled the deep water or ocean-going vessels of the Army, but also an inter-island service built to do transportation among the U.S. bases in the Philippine Islands, and a harbor boat or intercoastal service. The Army Transportation Corps was created in July of 1942. The Transportation Corps was responsible for moving soldiers from their training bases to the front and managing the ports of embarkation and debarkation in between. The various waterborne services of the Army became the Water Division of the Transportation Corps. The large ship branch of that division continued to be called the Army Transport Command. The Water Division included both military and civilian employees, who were referred to as the Civilian Branch. And while the Water Division was actually part of the Army, their uniforms looked more like they were in the Navy, and that's why the Army Transportation Corps emblem is on what looks to be like a Navy badge. This officer could have done a lot of things for the Army. Might have been an officer on a ship that was owned by the Army, like an engineer. Might have been the officer that was in charge of troops that were embarked on an Army transport. Or it might have been an officer that was involved in managing the ports where those troops embarked or disembarked. And if that all sounds confusing, it really was. What was called sealift services for the United States during the Second World War was managed not just by the Army Transportation Corps Water Division, but also the still existent Navy Overseas Transport Service, as well as the U.S. Maritime Commission's Warshipping Board, and something called Fleet Support Services, in addition to all the various ships of the United States Merchant Marine. It was very confusing and resulted in what one expert called a small constellation of different insignia and devices. One of the more interesting operations under the auspices of the Water Division that deserved to be remembered was the small ship section of the Southwest Pacific Area, or SWPA. This fleet consisted of fishing trawlers, schooners, ketches, luggers, tugboats, yachts, and ferries, acquired around Australia and New Zealand, and crewed by Army personnel and civilian merchant mariners, many of those from Australia. In a time when the U.S. Navy was committing few resources to SWPA, the shallow draft vessels of the small ship section played crucial roles providing supply, transporting troops, and performing medical evacuation. They operated as the landing craft for the island hopping in General Douglas MacArthur's New Guinea campaign. The small ship section has been called the ragtag or the forgotten fleet. And if it still surprises you that the Army operated ships and boats, something that you usually associate with the Navy and the Coast Guard, here's some statistics that might surprise you. During the Second World War, the Navy operated some 75,000 ships and boats, from its large surface combatant ships all the way down to its small landing craft. And the deadweight capacity of the Navy's dry cargo and transportation ships was around 8 million tons. In contrast, the United States Army operated some 111,000 ships and boats during the Second World War, around 36,000 more than the Navy. And the deadweight capacity of the Army's dry cargo and transport ships was around 17 million tons. Or in other words, the Army had a Navy bigger than the Navy. In 1948, the Secretary of Defense decided that all sealift operations for the United States military should be under the auspices of the United States Navy, and so the ships of the Army Transport Service were transferred to the Navy and made part of the newly created Military Sea Transportation Service, or MSTS, which in 1970 was renamed the Military Sealift Command. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.